and welcome to Framing the Foundation podcast. I'm your host, Sid Parulkar. We are very excited to bring you another guest on this podcast. We will be speaking to Dr. Josie Gayton, who has a PhD from Institute of Cancer Research from London. Josie is currently working as a chief operating officer for a radiopharma oncology-focused company called Precirix. Other than that, Josie also serves on the strategic advisory board for Par Clinical. And I've known Josie for quite some time now, but she joined our board in May of 2024. She has extensive experience working across multiple functions, from regular affairs to clinical operations to program management. Prior to joining Precirix, she was also the VP of program leadership and chief of staff at Egalia. And in her previous roles, she has served in multiple leadership capacity at Ipsen and Servier. I'm very excited to have her on this podcast. We'll dive into discussions about her experience with radiopharma and also nudge a little bit about what's happening to understand her perspective on what's happening with AI. So stay tuned and let's just dive in. Josie, thank you so much for taking the time to join this Framing the Foundation podcast. I think as you're aware, I think the podcast, our goal is to really focus on continuous education. But I did a little bit of introduction before you joined the call about your background. Tremendous experience, 20 plus years of industry experience working across multiple different functions. But I think it would be good for viewers and listeners to know about your journey and how your career has evolved. But I appreciate you joining us today.
Absolute pleasure to be here, Sid. Thank you very much for giving me the chance to talk to you and tell people about my career. So I did a PhD at the Institute of Cancer Research in London. And at that time, I really had no concept about the pharmaceutical industry. I didn't know really what I was going to do with my life, but I just knew that I kind of liked science and I didn't really want to go get a proper job. So I thought, PhD, go be a student for a few more years. During that time, realized that I probably didn't want to stay working in a lab, but didn't really know what else I wanted to do. And I discovered the pharma industry. And so my first job post PhD was in regulatory affairs for Lorex Santalabo. And that was actually a really great place to start, because in regulatory affairs, you get to see how the whole industry hangs together. I work with the manufacturing people, I work with the clinical people, I work with the preclinical people, I worked across the board, and I got to sort of see how you go from a kind of idea through to a commercial product and start to think about where I might fit into that and what I was interested in. At that time, I was relatively young, a lot younger than I am now. Didn't have a car, and I got to know a bunch of CRAs. And I thought, actually, I want to be a CRA because they get company cars. So my entire career is based around the fact that I wanted a car. Got to know a few of them. My then boss left and moved to another company, and they were looking for CRAs. So she contacted me and said, you should come to Servier. We're looking for CRAs. Come and join us. And so I did. I got my car, so I was very delighted by that. And then spent the next sort of 10 or so years working in clinical operations across a variety of different roles. And again, that was a really great place to be, to sort of start to understand, the sort of patient perspective and what data was important and, why we were doing what we were doing. Again, I worked on really early stage programs, late stage programs, regulatory programs across a variety of different therapeutic areas. And that was a really interesting time for me. I was sort of building my career. It was a company that really invested heavily in people, invested a lot in R&D, and gave me a lot of opportunities to sort of see how the work that I was doing could lead to something that would help patients and help the company in the long run. After a while, I got approached by, again, one of my other bosses who'd been at Servier for a while. He'd moved to Ipsen, and they were looking for global project leaders. And I moved to Ipsen in that role and led a variety of different programs, both from sort of late stage pivotal through to registration, again, translation from preclinical into the clinic, integration of different assets from different companies. And again, program leadership is a bit like regulatory. It's a really brilliant place to try and understand how everything fits together and how the early stage strategy impacts what you're going to be doing later on and what you're going to be able to do with that asset. And so that gave me a much more sort of commercial view, I think, to what we were doing. And, and also sort of the end goal, with the creating a medicine that's going to help a patient in the long run, whilst also, you're a commercial entity as a pharma company.
That's true.
And then I was
Josie,
there about
is it wise to say then, it's important to take chances as you go in your career till you find the sweet spot? I see you moving in different functions to now identify your.
That's true. I think it's true. I don't think you necessarily have to stay in one area for the entire career. I think it depends what you're interested in. I mean, I'm quite interested in a variety of different areas, and really my main aim is to try and create something that's going to help a patient and that the company is going to also benefit from commercializing.
Hmm.
And, in order to do that, you have a lot of different a lot of different sort of functional areas of expertise that you need to bring together. And that's one of the things I really like doing, is bringing those bits together. It's like doing a jigsaw puzzle. You need to have
Right.
the different
Right.
bits from, manufacturing or preclinical or regulatory or whatever.
Yeah.
And you put that all together and you create something at the end. And both regulatory and program leadership have given me that knowledge across a breadth of different functional areas that I can now pull on when I'm working, particularly in a smaller company. I think the other thing that's really important is also who you meet throughout your career. I mean, I've been
True.
very fortunate in that quite a lot of my opportunities have
Mhm.
come through people I've known, but they only want to hire me or give me those opportunities because they know that I'm capable of doing them. So, demonstrating to the people that you work with what you can bring is
Mhm.
also really important, and maintaining those relationships. The industry is not that big. You'll come across people that you've worked with
Yes,
previously
absolutely.
in other places. And so that sort of network of people that who know what you can do is also really critical, I think, in this day and age. What makes you different from everybody else, I
Yeah.
think is key.
A recent example is one of the CEOs at one of these mid-sized CROs. I had a chance to interact with them a few weeks ago, and it turned out I was in Asia Pac, and he was heading Asia Pac at that point for IQVIA
Yeah.
or Quintiles back in the day. So it's interesting to see where the connections lead to. But Josie, I want to say this, but I almost worked like 2.5 years in India before moving to the States. And there was a buzz about CRAs getting cars in Europe and in UK. So we were hearing about it on the other side of the ocean, or the continent, to say, oh, that's exciting, because I think the way CRA network kind of worked in Asia Pac was more about like logistics, was like local transportation versus owning a car.
And I think it's the same in the US. You're much bigger countries,
Yeah,
right? So the
yeah,
UK is pretty small. So
yeah,
it was pretty easy for me to drive up to
yeah,
Scotland or to drive down to Cornwall to go and monitor the sites
yeah,
that I worked at. But if you're based in Texas and your site's in, I don't know, New York, you've got
yeah.
to, you can't
It
drive.
is an
So
option.
it's kind of a different entity, I think, a different size
I just wanted
scale.
to mention that, we had heard about this story, and everybody was excited, like, oh, that would be fantastic to be a CR in Europe. So I didn't mean to cut you off there, but I think that was, I just wanted to share the perspectives and how things have evolved over a
Absolutely.
period of time.
But
And
it's a really good point, because it is different, and I think that's also an important factor. Although we work in a very global industry, and most of the companies I've worked for, them some of them have had a base in the UK, are not UK-based companies. So we're very global. We work a lot with different countries, but equally the sort of specificities might be slightly different,
different,
based on
yes.
wherever you are.
Yeah.
So.
No, but transition from like Serbia to Ipsen, and then in that program leadership, would love to hear more about how that evolved.
Sure. And so I was at Ipsen for around about 11 years. So either in program leadership, and then towards the end of my time in sort of senior R&D leadership roles. And I led a variety of different programs, which again were really great opportunities to meet people, to understand how the industry works, and how you can take a molecule through the drug development process. I mean, one of my best, I had sort of two really great successes that I like to think that I was quite involved in at Ipsen. One was getting the license to which really transformed one of the assets of the company from a few hundred million asset through to $1 billion asset. It went from kind of a small, fairly niche
Yeah.
drug into something that really transformed people's lives. And my team were instrumental in running the pivotal studies, and then filing both in Europe and the US, and getting that approval. Despite a lot of senior leadership or lack of belief by some of the senior leadership in that program, and that really revolutionized the company, I think. And then on the flip side of that, we also had an integration of an asset the company had acquired, and nobody was interested in it at all, apart from my team. And again, we managed to get that file, get that approved. Again, for a certain group of patients, it was really transformational, even though it was a small drug. So that was really a real opportunity. And then I also worked while I was at Ipsen, with our Chinese partners and our Japanese
Mhm.
partners to get approvals for our assets in Asia, which gave me a much more sort of global view of the world, I guess. And then in about 2018, I decided that although I like working in pharma, I kind of wanted to try biotech. We've been talking about the sort of biotech mindset a lot at Ipsen, and what does that mean, and how we wanted to sort of embrace this. And I was like, well, I kind of to go and see what that really means in practice. And again, I had a boss at Ipsen who had moved to a biotech company in the US, and she was looking for someone with my skills. And so I followed her to the company in the US. It was a rare disease company based in Texas with some enzyme replacement therapy. And I helped build the clinical operations team and the program leadership team, and we took the lead asset through pivotal trials and took through to registration. We partnered with a company in Europe for the US for the European rights. But that was my first experience of biotech. And when we started, the company was maybe about 30 people, and it was scaled up to about 100 and something towards the end. And again, that was a really great experience. I was at a point in my career where I felt I could take that risk. I was moving from something that was quite a company that was quite solid and had a lot of money behind it, into something that was a bit of an unknown for me. But I absolutely loved it. And I think moving from pharma to biotech isn't right for everybody, because it is really
Right,
different.
that's true.
You're working in a very resource constrained
Very different
environment.
mindset as
You have
well.
to sometimes do stuff that you don't necessarily want to do because there's no one else to do it. You just basically have to get on with things, and if there's a gap, you fill it. But I really like that, and I think every individual in a biotech company makes a really massive difference. Sometimes in a bigger company, you don't feel like you have that level of impact. And although early on in my career it was the right thing for me to do, and I got really great training and I got really great exposure, and I worked across a broad range of different things. Now I have the experience. I want to use that to help a biotech company or a smaller company with the sort of really exciting science take something forward. And I
Right.
think that's what I really, really love to do now. So in 2018, moved into biotech, and I've kind of been there ever since. So worked in rare diseases, and then for the last 3 or so years, I've been working at Precirix, as you know, for a radiopharm company based in Belgium, chief operating officer, really sort of helping to drive our programs forward.
Yeah, and Josie, I've worked firsthand with you there, and again, I appreciate you being on our strategic advisory board for Power Clinical as well, as we
My pleasure.
continue to focus to grow the company as well with our thought process to really help early stage companies. But as you were going through your career, I mean, what are some of the challenges and hurdles that you faced, and what is like your success mantra? What do you feel that is one thing that you go to when you're like surrounded by all these adversities, and especially in a chief operating officer role, which is like a larger lens that you put on across the organization? Would love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I really like building things. So, I like creating things, and I like doing things. I just really like things moving forward. So for me, being in operations is um it's a really great place to be, because you have the ability, once you have a sort of strategy and you're moving things forward, to see that progress. I like, I've never been someone who wants to sort of hold on to everything myself. I want to develop people, I want to create something, I want to build something. And I get a lot of pleasure out of helping my team develop and developing the talent, and really helping people to be the best that they can be as
Yeah.
well. And creating an environment where people can flourish.
And Josie, I want to compliment you for that, because having worked with you a little bit at Precirix as well, I think you give individual autonomy for people to drive it. I think it's a very difficult skill set for a C-suite person, because you're so used to being in control and want to control every aspect of it, but relying on the right person to get the job done. I think that's a very rare skill set. So I
And
appreciate that.
I appreciate you saying that, Siddhana. But I think really in biotech, that's absolutely critical, because I think, at its core, I really believe that kind of leadership is that ability to align people and create the sort of direction and drive things forward and make meaningful progress. But it doesn't mean you have to do everything, and you're not always the right person to do everything. And I think often companies flourish when you have the right people around you with the right expertise and the right attitude, really. A lot of it's not always about knowing how to do something. It's about having the right sort of mindset, and being really going, okay, so we have this project, we need to do this, I don't have anyone else who's going to do it, so we have to figure out how we're going to do it. And being able to do that. And as a leader in an organization, especially in biotech, you don't have to be the person who does everything. You don't know everything, and there are so many things that you have to be involved in. Really, it's important that you build a team who can can take things forward. And your role as a leader is to make sure people understand what the priorities are, what are the sort of short-term operational deliverables that you need to do to reach that long-term vision. You kind of need to be really laser focused on getting everybody aligned
Yeah.
behind that vision, and then letting them go with it, because everyone will be far more successful if you let
Yeah.
that happen.
And this is what I've seen, like a lot of companies, small biotech companies struggle is, people in leadership positions trying to hold on to the, despite of not being subject matter experts, trying to hold on and take decisions on behalf of such subject matter experts, which technically has a detrimental impact down the line. So I completely agree with you. Like hire the right people, let them do their job, and get out of the way. Let them focus on it.
And I think great leaders are kind of, well, I see myself as an integrator, right? So I feel that my job as a leader in an organization is to make sure that I integrate all of the bits that happen, whether that's the data, the people, the strategy, and make it all cohesive. And in biotech particularly, you're always working in a world with a lot of uncertainty and a lot of ambiguity. And you have to be able to make decisions based on imperfect data, and also based on potentially not having the resources or the expertise around the table that you would if you worked in a big pharma company. So you have to be able to make decisions based on imperfect data and minimize the risk whilst doing so. So you're kind of in this sort of balance between, speed,
Yeah.
yes, you need to do it fast. Yes, you're going to have to take some risks to make it
Yeah.
happen, but equally you kind of want to, minimize the potential impact on your investors and give yourself the best chance of success. And I really strongly believe that if you have a good team of people around you, you need to give them the chance to shine as well. I think it's, when you're a very small company, very early stage, one or two people can sort of do everything, but there comes a point pretty quickly where you need other people involved. And I think, building that right team and giving people the autonomy and but also the support to be able to flourish is important, and to build something that's able to move your program forward.
That makes perfect sense, and something that we are trying to also build here at Park Clinical is to really build that foundational team for early stage companies, and that's where, thank you so much for your leadership in terms of guiding us through that process. But as you know, with the current role and with the industry trends, radio pharma has been in the spotlight for the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, probably longer than that, but I have pretty much been exposed to it for the last 6 years. How do you see the field evolving, and what are some of the challenges that you feel are still existing in that, which are hampering the growth of some of these fantastic technologies and assets that are coming in, but lack the infrastructure?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I mean, I started my radio farm journey when I was at Ipsen. So I worked at Ipsen at a time when AAA were looking to out-license Lutathera.
Okay.
And at the time, we did do due diligence on it, but unfortunately, we couldn't quite, couldn't quite match Nova. So they ended up with the asset, and we didn't. But we did acquire a company called Pharm, and we also acquired another radiopharm asset. And it was very new at that time. There wasn't a lot of real knowledge about what the regulatory pathways were. There wasn't a lot of availability of isotopes. And although we did integrate the assets into the portfolio, at a certain point in time, they changed their strategy and decided to spin them off into separate companies. And that was around the same time I left the company. And then obviously I came back into Radiopharm about 3 years ago at Precirix, and the field had really changed. I think when I first worked on Radiopharm several years ago, everyone was really worried about how we were going to make it, how we were going to
Yeah.
get access to the isotopes. And that has changed to a greater or lesser extent. Although I think there still isn't an issue in terms of supply of certain isotopes, things like lutetium, which was really difficult to get hold of 10 years ago, is now pretty much a commodity. You can get hold of it fairly easily. And I think that is what will change with the other isotopes. So I think there are a lot more, there's a lot more infrastructure now available. There's more manufacturing, CDMOs who are able to manufacture radiopharmaceuticals. There's more access to isotopes, and there's more sort of knowledge about them. There are two commercially available radiopharmaceuticals. So you've got Pluvicto and Lutathera. I think the biggest change, and I think what happened was there was a huge amount of excitement about them, because I think fundamentally it's a really great idea. It makes a lot of sense, sort of scientifically and clinically. So there was a huge amount of early stage investment, and now people are kind of waiting to see that pay off. I always think of it a bit like CAR T. There was a load of excitement and people put loads of money into it, and then everyone went, oh, this is really hard, how are we going to manufacture this? And so then lots of effort and time and money went into fixing some of those challenges, and now we're kind of back on it's really exciting again. And I feel like radiopharma is a bit like that. There's been a huge amount of excitement, and now everyone's sort of waiting to fix some of the problems, and we'll kind of come out the other side. I think there's a few changes that you see. There's a change in the sort of isotopes that people are using. So there's a bit of a move away from, or addition. I don't know if it's a move away, but you have the sort of lutetium and the beta emitters as people are, embracing the alpha emitters like,
Yeah.
lead and actinium, but access to those is still quite challenging. There's a huge amount more supply coming on stream, certainly with actinium-225, and quite a lot of lead companies now are making quite good progress with their lead generators. So I think, in the coming years, those access to those isotopes that are needed will improve enough to be able to make these assets potentially commercially interesting. I think the other thing that we'll see is, at the moment, there's a huge amount of investment into SSTR molecules, which are kind of like lutetium, like Pluvicto. They may be a bit different, they may be a bit better, who knows? But as soon as we actually get some really good late stage clinical data with a different target, with a potential for a commercial product, I think that's when you'll sort of start to see a huge or some of the sort of return on that investment coming through. There's sort of the FAPs or the
Right. Yeah.
lots of stuff out there that's kind of interesting, but hasn't yet got to that point that's really demonstrated that it can become more mainstream. And I think you're going to see more. At the moment, it's fairly sort of specialized groups of physicians who use radiopharmaceuticals. You can sort of see, as you potentially have more potential targets, it becoming more of a sort of common pillar of oncology treatment, if you like. We're not quite there yet. Imaging is definitely improving. Real-time imaging is becoming much more doable, but the infrastructure needs to kind of improve a bit, and people's understanding of how to use radiopharmaceuticals and access to them will continue to evolve, I think.
It's always a trade-off, right? Because I think for the I would say the field to evolve, the infrastructure needs to evolve. But if there's lack of efficacy being exhibited, what are they going to? So it's like what are they going to do with the infrastructure? Like, so it's like,
Yeah,
yeah,
for sure.
catch-22 kind of. That's where I feel like, because I work for a couple of radio pharma companies as well. One of them was working with very, very closely with you at Precirix as well. But I think, and not pointing to Precirix, but there are other companies where I think logistics was a big, big, big challenge. Just too costly to transfer.
Sure.
Half-lives were an issue. So I think that's always been challenging. But do you still are optimistic about this field?
Totally. I mean, I think it has huge potential, and I think that there is a lot of really good evidence out there that is positive, that is trending in the right direction. And I think there will be other commercially available radiopharmaceuticals, but not in the next couple of years. It's going to be a little way down the line still.
Okay.
If you look at what's in development right now, you're not going to have something other than an SSTR2 or a PSMA for a little while yet, I think. But I think as soon as you start to see that, and you start to, there starts to be better access to the isotopes, there's a broader range of potential targets, then I think you can really sort of start to see how you could have a sort of more fully integrated sort of precision oncology treatment pathway for a lot of different types of cancer. I think also you're going to start to see more combination of radio pharma with other treatment modalities. You already see that across
Yes.
oncology, across a
Combination.
variety of different types of treatments already. So if you can get the right sort of sequencing, the right combinations, you could really transform cancer therapy, I think.
Again, the hot topic these days is AI and their involvement in drug discovery. And I don't know if there's ways to use AI to better streamline the radiopharma field in terms of like supply chain management, optimizing that. Any thoughts on where you see AI evolving and how its role has been so far, integrated with the whole drug development pedigram?
I think you're right. I think AI will change a lot of things in how we do things, and I hope that it will improve certain workflows. Like, for example, you talk about supply chain. I think that's a really good example. In radiopharma, it's really complicated because you've got the isotopes, that have different half-lives, and I think that the whole process can be improved, and I'm sure that AI will play a part in that. The place I see the biggest impact, and certainly in the short term, is really around selecting targets. I think we're going to move. So I think AI is going. So biology is becoming more sort of predictive rather than experimental,
Mhm.
if you like. And I think I can see that with a lot of the companies at the moment that sort of work in the drug discovery space, we will get to a point where AI is much more instrumental in selecting and choosing the right targets and finding things that are more likely to be successful. And I think where you'll end up having the bottleneck in the shorter term is how you then translate that into a clinical product and into something for patient benefit and demonstrating that it works in reality. So I think at the moment, there's a lot of discussion about what's the right target. I think AI will help us choose the right targets more quickly, and the sort of iterations and cycle times will reduce, and less money will get wasted on moving
Mhm.
targets that are never going to work forward. And then instead of the bottleneck being the right target, it's going to be, how do I take this target, which I think is the right target, into people and show that that works. So it's going to sort of move into the translation phase, I think. And then I think for sort of when you move down the pathway, if you like, into development, I think AI is it will also help probably reduce the sort of timeline and cost associated
Mhm.
with running clinical trials. The sort of real-time data and the sort of feedback loops you can get to adapt your clinical trials is going to become a really important thing. If you think about in the past, we used to spend a lot, or we still do spend a lot of money in drug development and drug discovery that doesn't actually then translate into a viable drug that's going to help patients. I really hope that over the coming few years, we see AI helping to target that investment into the right things. So you're still spending the same amount of money, but at the end of the day, you come out of it with something that's helping a patient,
Patient, yeah, makes sense.
with
Yeah,
something they need. We always hear these sort of statistics about the number of drugs you need to discover to get one commercially
yeah.
viable drug, hundreds. And, think about how much money that costs. If you can target that money into something that is going to have a higher chance of actually translating into a drug that's going to bring patient benefit, that's got to be a good thing for everybody. But I think the way we work will change. I think the bottlenecks will change. So even if you AI makes the sort of drug discovery step quicker with the sort of feedback loops that you're going to get,
Right.
and the knowledge that's sort of out there, there's still a piece where you have to then translate that into clinical trials and into patients to see whether it actually works in practice and if it's safe. But even there, I can see sort of the way that we adapt our clinical trials to take into account data in real time, and then make sure what we're getting at the end is valuable, will also change.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Interesting to see how the regulatory authorities also adapt the way that they review data and review submissions, because that will also have to change. I think we're in for a period of period.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a very pivotal moment in our industry in terms of how we will adapt, evolve to AI. I think it is significantly going to impact our industry in terms of how we develop drugs, and I think that's what you're trying to summarize right now. But do you see any challenges with AI at this point, or do you think we're moving in the right direction?
There are a lot of challenges. I mean, I think, there's a huge number of challenges and uncertainties, and you have to trust the data that's going in and coming out of it to an extent.
Yeah.
And I think we're not quite at a point where everyone really fully believes
That's what
100%
makes
everything
me
that comes
seriously
out.
nervous about it, like
Yeah,
garbage in, garbage out, right? So it's like,
exactly. And I think you're always going to need to have some sort of checks and balances to make sure that what comes out of it makes sense.
yeah,
And you're going to have to do you kind of you're going to have to do some wet work to make sure that what you see coming out of your modeling actually is what you see in real life. And we're not yet at a point just to for a AI generated algorithm or program to spit something out for us to go, yes, 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 we could just turn that into a drug and give it to patients. We're far, far from that. You still need to do all of the wet work in the lab and in
that
people.
that's where I feel like there's a lot of nervousness within the industry about, AI is going to replace jobs. But I feel that AI is going to help consolidate jobs, where I think you'll be more in a more, I would say, validation role, where you're
I
ensuring
think it
that.
will change. And I think that's what we're going to see across the whole of society is AI will get rid of some jobs, but I think it will also create other jobs. And I think there's jobs that we haven't even thought that we need yet that will
Yes.
suddenly become, jobs because of AI and the things that we can do that we couldn't do before. And I think it's true that the skills I had coming out of university will be
Oh,
different. Kids coming out of university now, or young adults coming out of university now need different skills. They're going to need to understand, how to work in a lab, and then also how AI works and
yeah,
what tools that they can use. I mean, I see it more of as a tool than anything else. I think it's a tool that can help us. Doesn't mean it doesn't have its challenges. And I think for sure it will. The number of certain roles will change. For example, in the past, if you think about how long it used to take from last patient, last visit to database lock or to filing or whatever, that time can be significantly reduced now, and you don't necessarily need many people to get to that point. So I
yeah,
think, but then you do need people to do other roles at other times that you probably didn't need in the past. So I think it's just going to change the balance. I mean, it probably will reduce certain roles,
yeah.
but I think it will create others.
Yeah, no, and I think I was talking to another chief operating officer from a company called Byberg Health, and they're into real world evidence.
Yeah.
And she mentioned that AI will not replace our jobs, but will be an add-on to what we are doing to help improve the quality and how quickly we can get done. So I think, and again, not trying to dive into that too much, but they could be like 4 working days, instead of 5 working days. So we do more with less. But yeah, I think that's where I see that entire
And
field
I
of
think I think in the past, I think, especially in our industry, you had a lot of sort of subject matter experts in certain areas. So you're an SME in, I don't know, stats, or an SME in clinical operations. I think what we'll see is people needing to know more about, maybe less about more. So in a way, I see that as the sort of my current job, if you like. As a chief
Mhm.
operating officer, I need to interact with lots of different functional areas. I don't need to understand all of their functional areas, but I need to know enough about them to challenge them and to ask the right questions and to make sure we're doing the right things. I'm not the expert in that area. And I think as we progress and AI becomes more of a tool that we use all the time, people are going to need to have a broader understanding of what is happening and how it all fits together. So perhaps you're going to end up in a situation where you need fewer SMEs, but more sort of people with a sort of general view of how things work.
That's great. Josie, again, we are 30 minutes into the conversation. Time just flew by. But I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being part of this podcast. I think that this is again a continuous education improvement process to really help our next generation of team members, or I would say professionals coming to the pike, to learn from industry experts like yourself on what it takes to. I keep saying this. You have to go through the grind to really understand what it
Yeah.
takes, and you should have the perseverance to really be patient, take one step at a time. And this goes back to one of the points you mentioned about like coming out of university, and sometimes you are just raw and don't
Mm.
understand where you're headed. That happened to me as well. I had no knowledge of clinical research coming out of pharmacy. All I knew was either production or
Yeah.
sales. And that's pretty much all I had. And this just happened to me. So I think that's where I think the exploration process is important. I think people coming out of the universities have to be open to that, to
Yeah.
understand where they fit,
Absolutely.
where they belong, and how they can evolve and grow there. But again, I appreciate your time. Thank you so
My
much.
pleasure.
I'll
Absolute
just
pleasure to talk to you.
put a link to your LinkedIn profile in the comment section. So if anybody wants to engage with you, they can definitely reach out to you, connect with you, and get to learn more about you.
Fantastic.
Josie, again, thanks so much. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks,
Yeah.
Sid.